Is India and the future of the free and open Indo-Pacific. India's stance on Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led some to question the trajectory of India's grand strategy. So the question before us today is India more likely to align closely with its Quad partners, primarily Japan and the United States, or is it more likely over time to become a third pole in international affairs, independent of both China and the United States? We're honored today to welcome a man who is an extraordinarily keen observer of international affairs, the Honorable Shigeru Kitamura, who is the former Secretary General of Japan's National Security Secretariat. He will examine India's strategic directory, both in formal remarks and then in a conversation with me. Shigeru Kitamura needs no introduction to those of us who follow Japan and Japanese politics and Indian and international affairs closely. He is not only Japan's second Secretary General of the National Security Secretariat, the man who set up its Economic Security Division. He was also the distinguished head of Japan's Cabinet Intelligence and Research Organization. He is a graduate of the University of Tokyo and France's École Nationale d'Administration. He has been decorated by the French government with the Legion of Honor, by the US Pentagon with the Distinguished Service Medal, and by the Australian government with its Intelligence Medal. And he is someone who is well known to policy leaders here in Washington and around the world. It's my honor, my pleasure to welcome him to the stage. I should also note that he is the editorial director of the now bestseller, widely acclaimed Memoirs of Shinzo Abe, which came out only a few weeks ago in Japan, and all of us await eagerly for the book to be translated into English. So with those remarks, I'm honored to welcome Shigeru Kitamura to the stage here at Hudson Institute. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ken Weinstein. Today's subject is India, especially related to the free and open Indo-Pacific. First of all, I appreciate very much your introduction about the memoir of the former Prime Minister Abe. I was in charge of the editorial supervisor. In this book, we can listen to the candid talk of the former Prime Minister about various issues, especially internal political issues and free and open Indo-Pacific. I hope this book will be translated in English and will be read by global population. First of all, I'd like to talk about the general situation of the world affairs concerning India. The US-China competition is a long-running structural trend. It's a struggle for political, economic, technological, and military supremacy between a traditional hegemonic power and a new superpower that has repeated itself in the history. Although there are areas of healthy competition and cooperation in the bilateral relationship, both sides face domestic public opinion that tends to provoke a confrontation leading not only to tariff and other trade restrictions, but also to critical technology and supply chain fragmentation, which means partial decoupling. However, the US and China are highly dependent on each other in business. and their economic relationship is solid, unlike that of the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, when trade was practically zero. Although there is no guarantee that decision will occur based only on economic rationality, both sides are keenly aware of the enormous cost of complete decoupling. Full decoupling would lead to significant domestic shortage and inflation on both sides, which would put considerable downward pressure on consumer spending and business activity. So, the political costs of the decision would be high. India, ASEAN, the Middle East, and other countries are growing in power due to their abundance of human and natural resources and sustained economic growth. These countries and regions are increasing their presence in the global south, which does not belong to the US, Europe, Japan, nor China, democracy or authoritarians. While both the US and Chinese camps seek to capture the third pole, these countries and regions are pursuing equidistant and omnidirectional diplomacy, as evidenced by their stance on UN resolutions and participation in economic sanction frameworks. They seek financial benefits and diplomatic independence, a preference for either the US or China may make it difficult to do business in so-called neutral regions. Based on the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, Japan aims to secure a rule-based international order and free trade. Third-party countries are sure to increase their national strengths and attractiveness as markets backed by abundant populations. ASEAN in particular already has strong economic ties with the Japanese economy and business. Still, India, in particular, will become a more significant player because of its future growth potential. While historic background vary, each country is not beholden to the US nor China, with whom it has a deep rivalry, but is generally oriented toward balanced diplomacy to secure diplomatic independence and economic benefits. India has the most room for growth among the US, China, and India. It will surpass Germany and Japan to become the third largest economy by 2030. Other economies of the US, China, and India will be comparable in size in about 50 years. India is the only nation that can compete with the US and China over the next 50 years. As the world's largest democracy, India experienced a war with China in the 1960s and still has a history of border disputes and China's expansion into the Indian Ocean. Historically, it has strong military ties with Russia. The Quad framework and the free and open Indo-Pacific partnership concept are shared by the four countries of Japan, the US, Australia, and India. India does not directly blame Russia for the Ukraine issue and imports crude oil from Russia also. India aims for international independence through economic pragmatism and all-around diplomacy. On the economic front, it has deep ties with the US, Europe, China, and Asia, all of which have FTAs and economic partnerships. In international politics, for example, it's a core member of G20s. It's really a third pole alongside the US, Europe, Japan, and China. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those deeply insightful remarks. It's rare these days in looking at international affairs that people talk in terms of 50 years from now. It's a reminder of the founder of Hudson Institute, Herman Kahn, who always believed that in order to get the contemporary picture correct, you needed to look at the big picture over the long term. And so it's very helpful for our analysis and for the discussion moving forward. So I thank you. Let me begin by asking you about something you talked about in your remarks. You talked first about the importance of domestic public opinion in both the United States and China driving the competition. And I wonder, as someone who knows Washington well, who is an unquestioned, dedicated ally of the United States, what you would tell our policymakers in terms of public opinion in the United States with regard to China. Do you think, as you look at the policy debate over China in Washington, are you concerned as an outside observer? Do you think the rhetoric is, there's all sorts of discussion. Sometimes the rhetoric is considered by some too harsh. Sometimes the rhetoric is criticized in various means. But how do you view things, and do you view them differently from a Japanese perspective?
The description in my remarks is the observation over the actual situation of both countries. Personally, I welcome the change of the public opinion of the United States. Especially, I welcomed the departure of the engagement policy of the United States, especially in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Up to that moment, I'm very anxious about some public opinion of the United States.
It was interesting because Shinzo Abe, over the years I knew him, he was much more skeptical of China than our leaders here in Washington were, concerned about technological developments, concerned about Chinese investment in Japan, Chinese investment in the United States, Chinese investment more broadly. And you know, then we saw here in the United States, particularly it was right here at Hudson Institute when Vice President Pence offered his speech outlining a new vision for U.S.-China relations in October of 2018. that things really started to change quickly and then became much more aligned with Japan's, the Japanese vision on China. But Japan has always had two sides to its vision on China. Even under Prime Minister Abe, there was also an engagement strategy as well.
I totally inclined toward the policy taken by the former Prime Minister Abe. He saw the situation, especially in the East China Sea and South China Sea, was so precarious for him, especially during the period of the land filling of Seven Shore. This occurred during the period of the tenure of the President Obama.
Yeah.
At that moment, Prime Minister Abe showed his imagery intelligence to the, of course, President Obama and other chief of the state of the European country. But it was so difficult for him to get the positive answer from the Western leaders. But during several years, the land filling for Seven Shores were accomplished. In the garden of the White House, President Xi promised that Seven Shore will not be militarized. But it's a total lie for the world, I think. Actually, the area inside 9-dash line was totally militarized, and there is no deterrence. And actually, it has become some kind of bastion, like the Okhotsk Sea of Russia.
Yeah, it was interesting because Prime Minister Abe was usually very guarded in his public comments. I mean, the memoir, which we all await for in English, being an exception because there were interviews he did where he spoke his mind on critical issues. But in the last major interview he did with The Economist, he talked about the fact that it was President Obama's retreat from U.S. global leadership that in part led him to pursue a much more active both military and diplomatic agenda, and this issue of the militarization of the artificial islands were at the center of his of the change in Japanese policy.
But I think it's totally right, I think. And he tried to do that. But finally, after the change of the U.S. policy, his persuasion was finally successful.
Yeah.
After his, the end of his tenure, he must be satisfied with the actual situation, I think.
Yeah, look, it was very clear to those of us watching from Washington that Prime Minister Abe was the leader of the free world in that period. There was all this talk in major publications about Chancellor Merkel of Germany being the leader of the free world, but we see her vision now in ashes with the failure of, with the havoc that Nord Stream 2 wreaked, the destruction of Ukraine, the war that followed, and whereas Prime Minister Abe's vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific being adopted by the United States, being adopted by Australia, increasingly being adopted by, adopted by Great Britain, adopted by Germany, adopted by the European Union, and it is a vision that has really come to the fore, and also the vision he had, which he took from his grandfather, of the closer ties to India in particular. And the India case, as you note, presents some challenges. India is both the chair of the G20, but is all hosting the G20 this year. Japan is hosting the G7. At the G20, we saw the presence of Foreign Minister Lavrov, who was also took part in the Raisina dialogue that the India Foreign Ministry holds. And then we're also seeing India is going to host the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes both Russia and China. And you mentioned India continues to buy oil from Russia and continues to maintain its multifold foreign policy of engagement in the Quad, obviously, engagement with the Russians, lesser engagement with the Chinese, arguably. But as you look at India's reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, were you surprised at all? What's your sense about what that tells us about deeper trends in India's foreign policy?
First of all, you mentioned about the diplomacy of the former Prime Minister. Actually, the Prime Minister Kishida promised to increase the military expenditure considerably, and it was welcomed by the US government. Maybe he is seeking for the 2% for the GDP. In considering actual surrounding situation, it's rational and it's good. However, during the tenure of the former Prime Minister Abe, of course, he increased the military budget. But comparing with the GDP, it's not easy to surpass the limit of the 1%. Therefore, I never asked him directly, but he preferred to enhance the deterrence through the diplomacy in seeking for the value of the democracy, rule of law, and no use of the coercion or changing the status quo. Therefore, he established multi-layered international structure like Quad, like free and open Indo-Pacific, and the cross-tie with the US. From time to time, the former Prime Minister Abe is criticized as a hawkish politician, but in reality, he is seeking for the democratic value and to maintain the stable relationship with our neighbors, PPRK and China and Russia. This point is emphasized even in the memoir of the Prime Minister. It's a first point. Second point, of course, we are rather irritated. We are a little bit irritated about the standpoint of the India against the Ukraine warfare. But in thinking about its position seriously, it must be rational decision-making by Prime Minister Modi. Of course, as I mentioned in my speech, India participates in the Quad. But the national interest of India is not the containment of China. They are seeking for some hegemony in the South and Western Asia, the number one in this region. But recently, this status was threatened by China. First one is one road from the seaboard, and another one in the Kashmir from the northern part. Several years ago, I talked with the Indian authority. They are not willing to participate in the Quad because they can understand the importance of this meaning. And for example, we must listen to the speech of the Prime Minister Modi on the occasion of the Shangri-La Dialogue. He never mentioned about free and open Indo-Pacific, and rather he underscored the independence of the diplomacy of India, and he made much of the centrality of ASEAN. Some American colleagues said to me he was disappointed. But in this speech, Mr. Modi expressed the real intention of India. Despite the participation of Quad, India is seeking for its own interest. As I mentioned, India's military equipment is almost occupied by the Russian-made. And they import crude oil from Russia also. From the viewpoint of the national interest itself, it's natural they never support the resolution of the Western countries. But India is also underscoring the security aspect with the US and Japan and Australia. Last year, we publicized a joint statement for Quad. Some said Quad meeting was degraded to the economic cooperation. But it's not true, because three pillars are important. One is connectivity. Second one is the cooperation in the advanced technology. Third pillar is internet security. Three pillars are economic one, but closely related to the security. I think connectivity is so important. As I mentioned, the PRC is threatening India from the vertical direction, north to south, to find out the exit to the ocean. Instead, India is seeking for the connectivity, west and east. This policy is totally going with the policy taken by Japan. Japan is seeking for the connectivity east and west. We must pay attention to such, signals and such move from India. And actually, I can understand very well the Indian policy. At the same time, it's so important. We must encircle India to our side through the various methods, especially economies, I think.
Because when you think of encirclement of India, normally you think of the Chinese with their ties to Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Pakistan.
That's right.
As sort of seeking, in a sense, to encircle India. And in India also has sought in different ways to begin to think through the infrastructure challenge in Southeast Asia. There's talk of building this rail line from Ho Chi Minh City and Jakarta to to India as well to begin to challenge the Belt and Road possibility. But I guess I have a couple of questions based on what you're saying. I'm wondering, first of all, if you have a sense as you look at the, and obviously the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific varies even between the United States and Japan, the United States and Australia and Japan, let alone India, which has the most inclusive and broadest sort of concept of the Indo-Pacific geographically as well as geopolitically. I wonder if would you say that the Japanese vision of the Indo-Pacific is in some sense closer to the Indian vision of the Indo-Pacific, or would the one might argue that the United States' vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific and India's is probably the one that varies the most, or do you not see that that balance, or is there a role that Japan can play that the United States cannot play in terms of trying to bring India closer in?
I think, the sphere of India and the sphere of the free and open India, free and Indo-Pacific, doesn't overlap.
Yeah.
It's true. But what is important is we can take advantage of the common interest, which are sought by Indian government and which are sought by ourselves, I think.
We're starting to see, obviously, this deeper economic engagement with India, as you pointed out. Even Foxconn is now moving manufacturing of iPhones to increasingly to India. There have been obviously technological challenges with that. I'm wondering, in your sort of industrial security, economic security hat that you have, do you talked about India, you talked about the importance of with the Quad of connectivity and cybersecurity and like. Do you see how trustworthy a security partner do you see India in how? I mean, including the United States, Japan, and Australia, we are incredibly tight partners in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of cybersecurity, which so much progress was made under your tenure, both at CIRO and at the National Security Secretariat, and on economic security. And I'm wondering where you see India standing.
First of all, today also I talked with my US colleagues. You mentioned about manufacturing the iPhone in India. I mentioned about the potentiality of India for the economy. But there are several challenges also. For example, some challenges stemming from the bureaucracy. Some challenges stemming from the social problems also. Some segment of the local issue also. Maybe in establishing the total cooperation, India must overcome such kind of challenges also. But in anyhow, we must pay attention to the positive element of India. Of course, there are lots of things to do, and but personally, I like to bet the potentiality and the future of India, and I'd like to pay attention to the biggest democratic country of the world. That's also a positive element of India, I think.
And India is also going to become the biggest country in the world just in next month, I think, is when it surpasses China in terms of its population. One of the interesting things this year at Davos to see was that the Chinese were not nearly as present as they used to be, and the Indians really were the superstars at Davos. And India has this potential to rise as the kind of third whole of international affairs with the United States and China. One wonders, where the Europeans will come out. That the Europeans are in a sense often critical of the United States for obviously both dependent on the United States, but also highly critical of us in different ways. And I wonder whether you think India will, the appeal of India in Europe, you know, you've obviously spent a lot of time in France and know Europe well from your broad government experience. Do you see India as exerting a kind of soft power diplomacy in Europe, as well as in addition to its ability to attract the global South, as you mentioned in your remarks?
I think the evaluation and appreciation has always two sides: an India of Quad and India of Global South. I think that's the same India, but the viewpoint is different. But as I said, we must cooperate with India in considering the positive element for the cooperation and to some extent the alliance, I think.
And in terms of the global South, Japan's role, what should Japan be doing now that it's not doing in terms of greater cooperation with the global South?
I think the role of Japan is so important because among G7, Japan is the only country which can bridge the ASEAN country and Western countries. And we have the special relationship with India. And we started for a long time the TCAT with African country. Happily, based on our constitution, peaceful constitution, reputation of the international community is rather good, and there is no history of the colonialism in Africa and the Arab countries. Japan must take advantage of such international image and play a positive role for bridging the European and the US and the so-called global South.
It was always a big part of Prime Minister Abe's diplomacy. In fact, he announced the free and open Indo-Pacific at in Africa at the TCAD summit in summer of 2016, and it very much had his eyes on the Indian Ocean countries in Africa, Kenya in particular, as central to his vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific. And China's behavior in Africa, while seemingly omnipresent, has also brought some irritation. Africans upset with the quality of infrastructure sold, Africans upset with the use of Chinese rather than domestic laborers, heavy-handed tactics by Chinese government, obviously widespread presence of the Chinese intelligence agencies and security counterparts in countries where China has become engaged. Do you see any change in Africa, on the African side, or an opening now in Africa for Japan? Certainly you see one for India.
First of all, I like to talk about the limit of the One Belt, One Road initiative. Maybe the administration of PRC observed some limit of the One Road, One Belt initiative, One Belt, One Road initiative. And because of the stagnation of the Chinese economy and no popularity of such kind of the behavior, I think it's a very good timing for us to proceed our own infrastructure cooperation vision toward so-called global South, in reiterating the value of the democracy, rule of law, transparency, and no interference in the internal politics.
Very interesting. Let me ask you one final question before we wrap up, and that's about Taiwan. Prime Minister Abe famously noted that a Taiwan contingency would be a Japan contingency. He made sure that the notion of the so-called Taiwan scenario became a subject of public debate in Japan, and that led to an increased awareness of just how challenged Japan's own security was in the case of some kind of a Chinese attack, whether it be open, whether it be gray zone upon Taiwan. Where do you think India would stand in the event of a Taiwan contingency? Can we predict? Would the reaction be similar to what we saw in the case of Ukraine? Would you expect a different assessment from India's leaders?
I'm sure that the Indian leaders, but concerning the Taiwan contingency, we can underscore two things. One is the geographical difference. Ukraine is connecting Russia directly, but the contingency of the Taiwan, the PRC must pass through Taiwan Strait. It's extremely extreme difficulty for the tactics of the Taiwan contingency from the viewpoint of the PRC. Second is the international reaction concerning the resolution against Russia on the Ukraine warfare. Almost 150, more than that, I'm sure, but such kind of countries vote for this resolution. But concerning Taiwan, internationally, Taiwan is isolated. Therefore, it's not easy for Taiwan to get such numerous support from the international society. This is two things I must point out. Second part is rather important. Prime Minister Abe mentioned Taiwan contingency is Japan's contingency. These words were also radically criticized by the public opinion newspaper. But militarily, it's a natural thing. Geographically, Taiwan and Japan archipelago is very close, so near is the first point. Second point, as I mentioned, the PLA must go across the Taiwan Strait. What is the biggest obstacle for this operation? It's a US base in Japan. It's a 7th Fleet, also in Japan. In order to wipe out the hindrance of the US military forces, tactically, it's normal, it's natural. The PRC attack, first of all, the US base and the 7th Fleet in Japan. That's why, despite the posture of Japan toward Taiwan, Taiwan's contingency has become naturally the Japan's contingency.
Well, thank you very much. This is, I know I've learned a lot. This has been, your insights are always extraordinary, and we could see why Prime Minister Abe, why Prime Minister Suga, and many others over many years have relied upon your advice in Japan and abroad. Just want to thank you, Shigeru Kitamura, for being with us. Honored to have you with us. And
Thank you very much
for sharing your insights.
Thank you very much.